If you are enjoying this podcast and other podcasts on the Dragon Wagon Radio Network, be sure to check out the Dragon Wagon Shop. Awesome t-shirts and mugs from your favorite shows so you can tout your podcast pride, all while supporting your favorite indie podcast network. And make sure to check it often for new items and limited time designs. So shop now at dragonwagonshop.com and get your dragon swag on. It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Steven Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers. On this episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, we're going to be learning how to make a film. Well, something like that. We're going to learn how to make a documentary film because our special guest, Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, is exactly that. She is a documentary filmmaker, and her latest film, Nothing Truer Than Truth, is now available at a downloadable site near you. We'll talk more about how you can access the film and where you can get it and when you can see it. It is currently screening privately and publicly at a variety of different locations that are scheduled throughout the coming year. And we'll talk to Cheryl about what her calendar looks like and the difficulties of promoting a new documentary and getting it out there and disseminating it to the world. But most importantly, we're going to talk about how the heck did Cheryl get into filmmaking in the first place. Cheryl, welcome to the program.
Hi, Steve. Thanks. I'm excited to be here with you. And I guess for me, film started when I decided I wanted to be a writer. So I'm really a writer. And I started working on other people's independent films back in the 90s as a publicist. So it's been an interesting journey for me, going from writing memoir material and then making the decision to turn that first memoir about being a punk rock band manager into my first documentary film.
Okay, wait a minute. Punk rock band manager. Okay, we'll have to get back to that in just a second because I definitely need to know more about that. But the first thing I wanted to point out, as you say, is that you were a publicist for films prior to this. So you sort of had a leg up once you had your film completed on getting it out there and promoting it. And how's that going for you? And I should mention to our listeners that you are on location right now. And we're so thrilled to have you not actually in studio, but over the airwaves, thanks to technology, because you are busy right now. This is a busy time for you getting it out there. Tell us what's going on. How's it going? Where has it screened? When has it screened? What's going on with the publicity of the film?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's actually challenging to do publicity oneself, but I've had a lot of help from people, friends of mine, contacts in the press. So we just got a great review in the Boston Globe. A friend of mine, Peter Keogh, is a film critic that I've known for many years, so that helps. But we just released the film online. It was released by Gravitas Ventures on Tuesday, February 12th. Prior to that, we did a screening in New York City at Anthology Film Archives, which was really fun to celebrate. And we had one of the people who's in the film, Rick Wagaman, actually came to the screening and did the Q&A with me, so that was great. I try to do Q&As with people who are either in the film or are interested in the Shakespeare authorship question, and so that's been really exciting. The next screening that we have is in Ashland, Oregon at Southern Oregon University. That's on March 29th. It's a Friday. Yes, March 29th, Friday afternoon. But prior to that, we had our premiere in April of 2018 at the Brattle Theater in Cambridge, Mass., part of the Independent Film Festival of Boston, which was really fun. That was great. And before that, we had screened at the Boston Public Library as part of the Shakespeare 400 celebration. And in London, this April, we're going to screen in London at the De Vere Society annual meeting. So
that's really fantastic. That. And then I understand when you go up to Oregon, are you also going to be in the Portland area as well?
I am, but I'm not screening the film in Portland, unfortunately. I would love to. I'm actually I'm moderating a panel at the Writers' Conference in Portland this year. It's on adaptation and screenwriting because I'm a manuscript consultant. I do consulting for screenwriters who are working on their scripts.
Well, you are definitely a Jill of all trades, aren't you? With the teaching people how to make a film, paneling films, promoting films, directing films, and how much of the process of making a film as a documentarian is more producer than director, and how much of it is more director than producer, or is it pretty equal?
Well, that's a good question. I think, the fundraising piece of it, which really is what takes so long about making a documentary film, is trying to raise the money. That's producer hat, definitely. So, it takes a lot of effort to get a film completed and then released. And so for me, having a business degree, that really helps, and working in finance for a long time too. But the director side is, what I think is the more creative part of it, where you're making decisions, about the final edit and doing the actual interviewing with people, which is, one of the most exciting things. I mean, for me, some of the high points of the film were interviewing Derek Jacobi, Diane Paulus from the American Repertory Theater. She flew in a snowstorm from Montreal, where she was rehearsing Cirque du Soleil, and we had exactly 45 minutes to film that interview with her. So that was really fun. That was exciting. And of course, meeting Derek, I've loved Derek Jacobi's work since I, Claudius, and I loved his latest show with Ian McKellen, Vicious. I think it's fabulous. So it was such a thrill to meet him. That was really exciting.
Okay, I want to talk about the great Sir Derek a little bit more in a minute, but I did want to stay on this difference between what it means to be a producer and what it means to be a director. Many of our listeners know that I am a producer and director of live theater productions, and one of the things I always say is I hate being a producer. I love being a director. And the only reason I'm a producer is so that I can direct. Is that sort of similar with filmmaking? Is there an aspect of that as well to what you do?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, I started as a writer, so the creative side, the story, finding the story, that's what excites me. That's why I made this film. I found out about Edward de Vere, and I said, what a great character. I'd love to make a film about him. But as I said, the business side, the having to raise the money and put together all the resources to make a film, it's necessary, and it's a whole different kind of skill set, obviously. So,
and it takes a lot of passion about the topic, about the subject matter, and about the artistic expression involved in directing, to then otherwise put yourself through all of the grueling, hair-pulling, going gray aspects of producing. So what I'd like to talk about is your passion for this topic, this subject, and how that impetus came about that led you to want to do a film about Edward de Vere and go through all of the work and all of the headache and trial and tribulation to get to this point.
Well, I was always someone who was interested in Shakespeare, in addition to, studying his plays and poems. I wrote poetry as an undergrad. I did an independent study at part of my undergrad in themes of androgyny in Shakespeare. So I was always interested in that. And then I was taking a class at Harvard University with Professor Don Ostrowski, who teaches a history course using film. And the premise of his history course was that we need to understand, how do we know what we know, and primary and secondary and tertiary sources. And, the further removed you get from the source, the way that impacts history. So that was a great class where he assigned us a paper, and he said, one of the topics you might want to write about is the Shakespeare authorship question. And I had never heard of it. It was 1997. As I said, I had loved Shakespeare all my life. And I said, what authorship question? And he recommended Looney's book, Shakespeare Identified. And so I read that, and I was absolutely convinced because, again, as I said, I had written poetry, and I really felt that the the comparison he did with de Vere's Juvenilia and the works of Shakespeare, the themes, the actual language used, really was the voice of the emerging poet. Clearly, a young writer, but still, for me, that was really convincing.
His Juvenilia. Now, for the non-literary, non-English majors, explain to us Juvenilia.
These were poems he was writing when he was about 12 or 13 years old.
Okay, because I was starting to think you were referring to some part of his anatomy that we should be aware of. So,
well, we should talk about Venice. Let's talk about Venice. But
we will get into that, because I know that a major topic in your film is actually the sexuality of Edward de Vere. Isn't that a big part of it?
Yes, it is. And so Looney just kind of hints at that. He talks about de Vere's kind of conflicted attitude toward women. And but then I found the book, after reading Looney, I found the book Alias Shakespeare by Joe Sobran. And that was where I found the argument that I incorporated both of these sources into my paper that I wrote, which was called Nothing is Truer Than Truth, based on de Vere's motto. I found Sobran's argument so convincing that the sexuality, the homosexuality, actually the bisexuality in the sonnets and in the plays was the primary reason for the pseudonym. And that's still very controversial today. It's interesting because many of the traditional Shakespeare scholars, for example, Stephen Greenblatt, who wrote Will in the World, and Stanley Wells, who's written many books about Shakespeare and sex, they talk about the sexuality in the plays and the poems all the time. But Oxfordians, not so many are interested in that. So that was kind of a controversial way to approach the subject.
Wait a minute.
For me,
Oxfordians aren't interested in sex? We're going to die out real fast if we don't change that attitude.
I mean that not everyone's interested in talking about the sexuality in the plays and the poems, because there's so much there to talk about. There's a lot of material. And so it was, when I first started talking about making this film, it was controversial, and it still is. I mean, but that hasn't deterred me at all. I mean, I find it really interesting. So
well, I think that it's important, not to steal your thunder, and you've obviously done more research on this and you know more about it than I would, but I think it's important to note that sexuality in Elizabethan times was thought of far differently than we would construe it today. Actually, I take that back. It's probably more in line. We're probably more in line now than we have ever been before as a society with the way it was construed back then, in the sense of sort of like the Roman aspect of it. And love between men particularly is discussed in that sort of Greek or Greco-Roman way, I think, in a lot of cases in Elizabethan literature, and especially in the works of Shakespeare. Would you agree with that?
I would, because I actually teach a class. I teach freshman English composition, and I teach a class where the theme is gender, sexuality, and identity in literature and film. And we go from Sappho to Plato right to the English Renaissance. And there's a direct line from Plato to the English Renaissance when people are talking about, the love between men being the highest form of communication. So I agree with that. I also think that although we didn't have the same terminology then that we have today for different sexual preferences, that there was a group of poets in London in the 1590s that self-identified as what we would call bisexual today. So I think that although we didn't have the terminology for it, it's clear that there was an existing group of poets at the time. That's Renee Weiss's discovery.
And I think if you look at the plays, particularly, obviously the most glaring examples would be plays like Twelfth Night or As You Like It. Those are the two that immediately come to mind, where there's an obvious homoeroticism going on between characters, even though those characters are maybe actually quote unquote female. And I say that meaning that we all, obviously everybody knows that in Elizabethan times, all the actors were male and it was young boys playing these female roles. But nonetheless, the characters are supposed to be women disguised as men. And you have characters like Duke Orsino, for instance, in Twelfth Night, or Orlando in As You Like It, who find themselves overwhelmingly attracted to what they believe to be young boys in their company, even though we as the audience are led into the secret that they're actually women in disguise. It doesn't change the fact that these male characters are meant to be questioning their sexuality in the presence of this person of their attraction and desire. I don't think a writer writes that unless they're inclined to know something about it.
Right. Well, that brings up the point of, does a writer write from experience, which is another kind of controversial question about Shakespeare's identity. And I would argue that the writer does. It's not entirely autobiographical, but certainly they draw from their own life. And I agree, completely that what Shakespeare does in the plays is really playing with gender, just like the sonnets play with words, that he's kind of questioning gender and identity throughout the plays, and that's what makes them interesting to read. And I definitely think he was interested in that. He was interested in psychology. And what I love about the end of As You Like It is when Rosalind breaks the fourth wall and speaks directly to the audience and says, I would kiss as many of you as had beards as, and kiss as many that didn't. So it's a real direct come on to the audience, which I think is fun.
One of the few famous epilogues in the Shakespearean canon, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
And oftentimes it's left out of many live stage productions. And so a lot of audiences don't see that and aren't inclined to study it that way.
That's right. Just this past summer, we go out to Tanglewood every year, and we always go to Tina Packer's Shakespeare and Company, because she was gracious enough to appear in the film. And she has the great line in the film where she says, well, I think, in Shakespeare's time, everyone just slept with whoever was to hand. And it gets a big laugh because she laughs. But she, her production of it just this past summer did that exact same thing. It cut that line. And I was sitting in the audience saying, what? Wait a minute.
Well, the titles of those two plays, even as well. I mean, As You Like It, take it as you like it, and don't judge me for how I like it. A lot of people aren't aware that Twelfth Night, the title of Twelfth Night, is not actually Twelfth Night. It's What You Will. And exactly. Again, the reference is what you will, as you like it. That's very suggestive of, to each their own. What you do in your bedroom is your private thing and none of my business.
Right. And to jump ahead then to Venice, for me, when I decided to make this film about de Vere's life, I chose to focus on that year and a half when he traveled through Europe, around Italy, and from his home base in Venice. And for de Vere, going there must have been, quite the experience, because Venice was renowned then for its liberal attitude towards sex. It was a place where there were many openly homosexual people, to the extent that they had tried to control the problem by, allowing prostitution, and but the female prostitutes found that they had to actually dress as men in order to get customers. So for de Vere, I think going to Venice in 1575, 76, again, kind of demonstrates that he was interested in all of that, in the courtesanas, in everything that was going on there.
Well, from what I know about Edward de Vere, he was interested in just about everything and anything, and a lot of everyone. One of the things that we learn about this guy is, talk about jet-setting playboy of his day. I don't think you could argue against that when you look at the evidentiary record that we have of his spendthrift ways and his exuberance, his love for fashion and music and dance, and the amount of money he poured into supporting other writers and other publications for print, I think proves that he definitely wasn't your stodgy, stuffy collar Puritan by no means.
Right. No, I love that image of him too, of kind of, regaling people with his stories, because again, that, comes from Mark Anderson's wonderful book, Shakespeare by Another Name, which I optioned the rights to for the film. But, he describes him as, and other people describe de Vere contemporaries as, loving to spin tall tales and entertaining everyone with his stories. And you can just imagine him as a kind of not only A-list party boy on the continental circuit, but a kind of Dorothy Parker, or even Keith Richards, just someone larger than life who was so entertaining that, his charisma, I think, must have been quite impressive.
So we have this big giant celebrity of the Renaissance age, this true Renaissance man he epitomizes the era in so many ways. How come we haven't seen more movies, more documentaries, more episodic television based on this guy? How come it took you to give us this definitive documentary about his travels to Italy, for instance?
Well, I do think that it's controversial. There was an excellent Frontline documentary called The Shakespeare Mystery, 1989, that a lot of people saw. That was their first introduction to Edward de Vere. And then, of course, there was Roland Emmerich's big budget film Anonymous, that I believe came out in 2011. And, people thought that was really going to make a difference, that people were going to finally say, wow, this guy's so interesting. But what happened with Emmerich's film was that the critics, again, kind of criticized the premise of the film, and it really didn't get a lot of recognition as a result of that, which is, it's unfortunate. But I think it's so taboo still in academia. There are professors at universities around the country, here in the US and around the world, who are talking about this, but there are many, many more who are afraid to. They're afraid of losing their tenure. It's really kind of shocking, because obviously myself, as someone who teaches and just someone who loves learning, the idea of education is all about scholarly inquiry. It's about critical thinking. It's about questioning what you know and trying to find out more, and so it's really surprising that there's such fear of talking about Edward de Vere as Shakespeare.
It's almost as if they're afraid the Queen will cut off their heads.
I don't know what it is they're afraid of. I really don't know. But for me, it was, as I said, first and foremost, an amazing story of a person whose life was just absolutely fascinating. And it's, as I said, I only chose a year and a half out of his epic life. So much happened to him before he left for Italy when he was 25, and so much happened after he came back to England. But for me, that was kind of when he became Shakespeare. Before he left, he had been writing the poems, and when he came back, they were just published. And then when he came back, the first theaters were being built in London, and he was, very much involved in the theater. And so I felt like that was the critical year, in his life.
Now, you mentioned earlier optioning a book for your film, a book by the author Mark Anderson, Shakespeare by Another Name. And that's for our listeners if they'd like to go and look for that book, Shakespeare by Another Name by Mark Anderson. One of my favorites, actually, I have to admit.
It's a great book.
And what's that process like? Obviously, you must have known Mark ahead of time, so it's a little different, I would assume, than if you just picked up a book somewhere and went, ooh, I'd like to turn this into a film. But what's that process like, optioning a book for a film?
Well, it's a little bit different for everyone, because you kind of come to, an agreement about the terms, both parties. But I didn't know Mark before.
Oh, you didn't?
I read the book. No, I went to after I did that paper for the class, then I looked on the internet and I found that Mark and Roger Strittmatter were both working together on a book that it appeared to me it would become the definitive biography, but it wasn't even done. And then Roger left and did his groundbreaking research on the Geneva Bible, and Mark finished the book. And I went to the book signing. My first film had just been released. It was 2006, and I went to the book signing at the Brookline Booksmith here in Boston, and introduced myself and said, I'm a filmmaker and I would love to option this book. And, I gave him a copy of my first film. And then I met him again out in Ashland. That was my first Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship conference that I went to. And I had lunch with him there, and we talked about it. And then, as I said, we went through the process of coming to terms, how long would the option be for, and what things could I use and what couldn't I use, so it's rather complicated, but I'm really happy because it's a great book. And as I said, for me, it was, as soon as I read it, I knew I wanted to make a film. So.
Another favorite one of mine is Richard Rowe's book, Shakespeare's Guide to Italy. And I wonder, when I read that book, the first thing I wanted to do was create a tour of Italy that I could go on and visit each of the sites that Richard Rowe points out and look for each of the details that he points out. Did you use Mark's book or Richard's book or any other sources as sort of like a roadmap for how you put the film together, how you wrote the script?
Yes, well, the narration is based entirely on Mark's book. There's only a little bit that I added, and he did some other narration that's not in the book as well for me. But I definitely used both sources because Mark had been there, and so definitely used his book. But I also used Richard Rowe's. I was very fortunate to get to meet Richard Rowe before he passed away. And when we went, for example, to Verona, we found the Sycamore Grove. We found the church.
That's my
St.
favorite.
Peter's.
That's one of my favorite references, the Sycamore Grove in Verona.
So it was great. It was really fun to have both in hand. Also in Verona, the bridge. So everything that was in Rowe's book, we went and filmed, which was really exciting. But it would be a great tour. I mean, I know Anne Zajic, who just passed away, did a fabulous tour, that people would go and visit the site. She also did one in London as well. But,
well, I think there maybe needs to be a Nothing Truer Than Truth tour headed by Cheryl Eagan-Donovan. How about that?
That would be great. I would love to do it.
You could take us to all the sites where you filmed and explain in more depth and more detail than your film is able to do. And I would sign up for that.
Great. That sounds great. I had a Venetian location coordinator, and she was fabulous, Deborah Cesana. And so she got us permission, to film at all these palaces. It was just fabulous. But I would love to do that. It was the filming that we did in Italy, we did in 7 days. So it was
wow.
Yeah, it was intense every single day. But I mean, there's nothing better than getting up at, 6 a.m. in Venice and having St. Mark's all to yourself, except for the occasional pigeons, because everyone sleeps in, because it is a party city. Nobody gets up. We couldn't even get a cup of cappuccino at 6 a.m. because everyone's still asleep. But it was wonderful. And yes, I would love to go back.
So you basically did, you were a guerrilla filmmaker then, right? You set up, get it done, get out before anybody arrives.
Yes, that's the nature of independent film. I didn't have the big crew, the big budget like Roland Emmerich. So that's how we did it. But it was really fun. It was
What sized crew did you work with when you were out there?
It was myself, my production coordinator, and the camera person.
Wow. So that's really bare. That's super bare bones then. And,
yes,
and you did all your post-production?
Some of the stuff we did in London, we had a sound guy as well. So that helps having a sound person, as you know.
And then you take all the footage back and you do post-production back here in the States. How did that work?
Yes, well, that, again, was quite a process because with documentary film, you tend to, the shooting ratios are really kind of crazy. You shoot a lot of material, and we shot a lot of material over a long period of time. So I worked with two really great editors. First, Trina Rodriguez in New York. She's a producer as well, and she really helped me shaped the film to the point where, again, we were able to do some preview screenings and raise some more funds. And then I found a Chinese editor, Zimo Huang, who did the final edit, and he was really great. He really helped me, discover the version of the film that was going to make it to the theaters, because part of the problem was trying to make the film interesting for people who don't know all of these details about Shakespeare or de Vere, how to balance, the factual information with the entertainment, as it were. So that was really what we worked really hard on. And,
it sounds sort of like making a giant Hollywood sequel, where you want to make it so that people who saw the first one enjoy it as a sequel, but people who never saw the first one can still enjoy the movie.
Exactly. I had a lot of people, because, as I said, people were so supportive in the, Oxfordian community. I couldn't have done it without the support of so many people. And that, included not only donating to campaigns, but also appearing in the film. And not all of the footage that we shot is in the final cut, so people were very generous with their time, agreeing to be interviewed. And some of those interviews, only were used for fundraising purposes. Some I've added as extras now, that the DVD is available. But that was really critical to have that support. And so they were great too in helping me with the fact checking. The people who really know the material were the first to tell me if there was something inaccurate in the film. So that was great.
So that leads to my next big curiosity, which is when you're deciding who's going to appear in the film, or better yet, who you'd like to appear in the film and who you're going to ask to appear in the film, and then dealing with the acceptance, the rejection, or the difficulties in schedules to get somebody. Like you said, you had, was it Tina Packer you said who had to come in, or Diane Paulus you said who had to come in and you had 45 minutes only to get it, one and done, and that's it.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that process. How did you first decide who you wanted to ask?
Well, I was looking, first I met all of the people involved in the authorship question. So I was interviewing people with various types of expertise. But as far as people that were perhaps better known, like Diane Paulus and Derek Jacobi, it was really just a matter of asking. And some people were very receptive, which was wonderful. And other people were not. So that was interesting. Other people did not want to be in a film about Edward de Vere. And so right here, at Harvard, there are so many people. I mean, American Repertory Theater is affiliated with Harvard. And so it was wonderful that Diane was willing to be in the film. She's not an Oxfordian that I know of, but she wanted to talk about Shakespeare, which is wonderful. And they have been super supportive. We've done several fundraisers there. It's just really been great how helpful she has been. But other people at Harvard, like Stephen Greenblatt, Marjorie Garber, Helen Vendler, I've asked all of them. And Stephen was always very gracious and said, he just had another book tour that he had to do. He is very prolific, so he was never able to find time. Helen Vendler too, she wrote a book on the sonnets. She just said she was too busy. And Marjorie Garber, although she's friendly with Diane Paulus, did not respond to my request. So there were many other people that I tried to engage who did not want to appear in the film.
So you got a few responses that were, I'd love to, but I'm washing my hair that night and I don't know that I can make it. And you got a few responses that were, lukewarm here or there with a thanks but no thanks. Some flat out just, we are going to ignore you. It's a jury summons. We didn't receive it. I did. It must have got lost in the mail. But tell me about any, if you can, and if you can't, podcast shame them, then we'll understand. But tell me about some of the flat out rejections. Did you meet with any animosity from people who you asked to be involved with the project?
No, that's one of the interesting things. I mean, again, as I said, Stephen Greenblatt's always been very gracious, and I go and hear him speak whenever I have an opportunity. And, he is a very good writer. But people are concerned about their ability to sell books and to continue teaching. That's really, I think, what it's about. I mean, Steven Pinker is a great writer who's also at Harvard, who I've known since before that he was at MIT. I talked to him about my first book because in my first film, in his book, How the Mind Works, he wrote a lot about music. And so I was making my first film about music, and I talked to him about that. But I think, again, because he teaches at Harvard, he just did not want to be in the film. And I had a similar experience in Italy. The person who appears in the film, Alberto Tosoffe, he's an Italian television personality. But I was referred to him by Professor Shaul Bassi, who teaches at the University of Venice. And Professor Bassi, did not want to be in a film about de Vere. So I think, as I said, it's still considered very risky to talk about de Vere as Shakespeare. So they both wrote a book together, the two of them. Bassi and Tosoffe wrote a book called Shakespeare in Venice. So it's interesting.
That is very interesting, because I think that the de Vere connection to Italy, and particularly to Venice, comes out so clearly throughout the Shakespearean canon. And when you look at 13 plays out of 37 are set in Italy, that's a huge number for somebody who, according to the Stratfordian position, never stepped foot off of the English Isles. And I think that beyond the Italian plays, if you look at character structure, stock characters, comic scenarios, you find somebody who obviously had direct hands-on experience with the art form of theater, and especially commedia, as it was developing at the time during the late 1580s in that part of the world. So I think that you can't deny that connection, and that's one of the strongest cases for de Vere as the author, in my opinion.
Right. No, I agree. But I have to say, I was very pleased with everyone who did agree to appear in the film. For me, I started by meeting Derek's partner and Richard Clifford at the Folger Library in DC. That was really exciting. He was appearing in a play about Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth. And so, I was really nervous, but he was just so lovely. And then, I was able to screen the film for both of them in London when I went to film at Westminster Abbey. That was one of the last things we shot, one of the last
So tell us about Sir Derek, because a theater buff like me, and you start talking about Derek Jacobi, and I start to get kind of tingly. He
is absolutely the nicest, most down-to-earth person. I was terrified, as you can imagine, as I said, when I then invited him to see the film, and he was just so nice, and he's so relaxed. He's not, uptight at all. He was just the most wonderful person. And when we were doing the second interview after I screened the film for him, the first footage I shot was on mini DV a long time ago, and so it didn't look as good. And I said, it'd be so great if we could just shoot a little bit more, on HD. And so he agreed. And when we started the interview, the cameraman, we did a question and he did an answer, and the cameraman said to me, "How's that, Cheryl? Is that okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, it's fine." And Derek says, "Oh, I got the job, did I?" He was just so funny. It was really great to put us at ease.
Spoken like a true veteran thespian, right?
It was great. Yeah, he's just lovely. And as I said, to have the opportunity to meet him, was obviously a thrill for me. And I'm so glad that he's been so supportive of the film. I mean, I think it's really important that he and Mark Rylance are willing to speak out about this, because again, they have been criticized for that. It's really unfortunate, but it's not a popular topic for discussion. So
it doesn't
it's really
seem, I mean, maybe they would, obviously they would know, and maybe they would say otherwise, but it doesn't seem to me like it has affected their careers in any negative way that I'm aware of.
No.
They both continue to work. They both continue to be recognized for the quality of their work.
Of course.
And
Yes,
they
but it's
both
still,
continue to
that,
work with staunch Stratfordians on occasion as well.
hmm That's true. I mean, Ian McKellen, I think, is wonderful because, he does a lot for people who are, young people who are gay and bisexual, and he's really supportive of, diversity and respect for all, but he's not an Oxfordian, so it's really interesting that, Derek is so willing to be so vocal about it because, as you said, it hasn't affected his career, but again, academia criticizes them all the time. I mean, when they did, the two of them, Mark Rylance and Derek Jacobi, did the interview on NPR again during the Shakespeare 400 celebration, that was a great interview. And I've heard professors say, well, they're actors, so what kind of, what does that matter? I mean, I think it's just the opposite. Of course, they're actors who've done the canon, how many times. I mean,
I love that.
I think
it's interesting.
they know the material.
It's interesting you would say that, Cheryl, because, obviously I'm an actor. And there has been throughout history a certain level of disparagement that we actors have had to suffer, including in this country where there used to be signs on the doors of establishments that read "No dogs or actors allowed."
Right.
So, I totally get that. But one thing that I do find to be very true, especially among Oxfordian scholars and authorship doubters, is there tends to be a much higher level of respect for theater artists and their knowledge of the canon because of, as you say, we have performed the works. We have lived the characters in the plays on stage before an audience, studied their relationships with the other characters in a very human way. And I think that's one of the reasons, from my perspective, and I would love to have the opportunity to even talk to Derek Jacobi for 10 minutes about this, but it's one of the reasons why the case for Oxford stands so strong with me is when I look at his life, and Anderson's book particularly painted it out for me so well. When you look at the life of Edward de Vere and you look at the characters and the storylines and the plays themselves, you see a match. It's an instant, obvious match. And when you put those connections together, the characters suddenly have so much more depth and strength to them because you understand the message the author is trying to convey through the character.
Exactly. And I, often say to my own students, we wouldn't say it doesn't matter what we know about the writer's life with any other writer. I mean, I taught a class of, drama from the Greeks to the Renaissance, which was great. And for every author, I think it's important to understand their background. How did they have the means to write? And what were their experiences? Did they serve in the military? Were their parents wealthy or were they not, middle class, or, all of that goes into a writer's work. And I think, for example, with the modern playwrights, we would never say that knowing about Tennessee Williams' life doesn't help us understand the plays. We just wouldn't say that.
Oh,
So
that'd
it's
be the most
interesting.
ridiculous. That's a great example. And that would be one of the most ridiculous things to say, especially when you look at, and here I'm going to use this word again, when you look at his juvenilia, Williams' lost plays, as it were, that have been coming to us over the last decade or so. Especially there was a big Jubilee celebration of him not too many years ago. And a lot of the works that were presented were some of his earlier works or one-act plays that he had written. And when you look at some of those, you see so much of the truth, and oftentimes very ugly, bitter truth of his life coming through those works.
Right. Yeah, he's a fascinating writer who I, enjoy teaching in my class. And I actually, one of my manuscript clients just wrote a screenplay about a summer in Provincetown that he spent, which is fabulous. I hope it gets produced. And another friend of mine here in Boston at Grub Street Center for Creative Writing, where I do consulting and some teaching, he just wrote a book, Chris Castellani, called Leading Men, about him and his relationship with Frank Merlo and when they were in Paris. So he's a fascinating character. But I think that does help us understand the plays. It definitely helps us understand them. So.
Well, knowing the nitty gritty, dirty, and here's the thing. Your film is called Nothing Truer Than Truth, as you mentioned. It's the de Vere family motto, which is actually in Latin. And not in English, but meaning the same. But truthfully, there's almost like a little parentheses you could put is nothing truer than truth, especially the bitter truth. And I think when you look at some of the terrible tragedies and challenges and horrible things that de Vere suffered in his life, you see those playing out through the plays as well. And you start to see this work of art as his own personal therapy in many ways, I think, based on his relationships with his mother, the early death of his father, his relationship with his wife, his father-in-law, the queen herself, that all plays out so clearly in the canon and including his, how many months exactly was it in Italy? 13, 14?
More than that, 16 to 18, I think. Well, he left in March.
A year and a half?
He arrived in May in Venice. But yeah, a year and a half. Mm-hmm.
A year and a half in Italy has got to change you. It has got to make an impact on you.
And that's why, that was the perfect story arc for the film. Again, I'm a writer, so I was looking for the arc. So it's a journey, right? It's the hero's journey. He leaves England. He leaves the backwater, and goes to this fabulous cosmopolitan place that's Venice is literally the crossroads of the world, is very exotic. And he comes back and he's changed. He's a new person, based on those experiences, having met the artist, seen the artwork, met other writers. He would have met Piccolomini. He had seen the Commedia dell'arte performed, as you said. He had heard the music and obviously he loved the clothes, so he brought back the clothes as well. So yes, that's what made it really work for me for the film, because it had the perfect arc.
And this guy didn't just do a little backpack trip of Tuscany to taste wine. Like, he did the continent and he did it right. I think I saw somewhere where there was an estimation of how much money he spent in the time that he was there touring. And if you were to equate that into modern day dollars, it was like $1 million trip.
Right. It would be more than $1 million today.
Yeah.
Yes,
more than $1 million to do a tour of Italy. I'd like to have $5,000 to do a tour of Italy if I could. Thank you.
It's great, though, because it's referenced in As You Like It Too, where he says, he's melancholic who sold his own land to see other men's. And that's exactly what he did. The whole time that de Vere was in Italy, he kept writing to Burley saying, sell some more of my lands, because I have to keep traveling, So it's really interesting, as you said, how much of his life he puts into the plays. And, that was another thing that drew me to his story, because I'm interested in artists and, what makes them really successful at expressing themselves in one or more mediums and then kind of a disaster at the rest of their lives. So that was an interesting thing for me to look at.
It's not uncommon with many of the great artists throughout all of history, in fact, that they had these very extravagant or eccentric aspects to their lives, oftentimes having issues of scandal, substance abuse, problems with love, or high levels of promiscuity. His life truly does fit that of an artist. I got to be careful what I say here, don't I? I'm kind of painting. I'm not one of those artists. But yeah, he definitely fits the artist's profile. You mentioned earlier in the conversation, and I wanted to touch back on, because I put a little footnote in the back of my brain, something about punk rock music. And I didn't want to forget that. And since we're talking about wild, crazy artists, I want to know what you meant when you said that you managed a punk rock band.
Well, I managed a couple of bands way, way, way back in Boston here. And one of those bands, they were members of this band called the Real Kids. It's not the new kids on the block. They're the Real Kids. And they had a following around the world. They still do in Japan and in Australia and in Italy. They have fans who absolutely love their music. And I was writing a memoir about my time because there weren't very many female band managers then. I was in a writer's group here in my town in Winchester, Massachusetts, and people said, that would make a really great film. And I had already started working as a publicist on other people's films, so I kind of knew how to do it. So I took a leave of absence from my writer's group and decided to try to make that film, and was much more successful than I had ever expected. We had a great festival run, and then we had a little art house run. We played at the Gene Siskel Theater in Chicago.
And the title of that film.
The title is All Kinds of Girls. It's from a song. And he's really an interesting character too. Really brilliant writer, but really a disaster in the rest of his life. And it's, it's unfortunate because he's so talented, but every time there was an opportunity, he would kind of, shoot himself in the foot or just make the wrong decision, and he burned his bridges all the time. And so it was a fascinating story, to look back and see how close he had come to having great success, when he first started out, and how he kind of missed those opportunities, but how the music kept him going. That
I
was
see
the
a
most
theme
important
here.
thing in his life.
You have an affinity for bad boys. That's the theme I'm seeing here. Did you have trouble dating growing up? Were you always dating the bad boys? Were you always getting into trouble?
No. It's really about the artist, I think. That's what interests me, because I do identify as a writer and a filmmaker, and, trying to understand that, why are relationships difficult? Why is it difficult to manage those other parts of your life, when you're so focused on making music or writing,
but everything you
plays.
just said is exactly the same about Edward de Vere, though. Every opportunity,
that's right.
He stepped on his own sword, pardon the terminology, as often as he did anything. The man was constantly stepping on his own sword.
Right. And I think, like de Vere and Shakespeare, I'm interested in the psychology of it. That's why, that's really what drew me in as a writer. So, yeah.
He was the punk rocker of his day.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah.
The punk rocker of the 1580s, and then you ended up doing one from the 1980s. I'm guessing.
That's right. That's right. 80s. Yes. And again, one of the best things about making that film was, interviewing people. I just, I love that part of it. So I got to interview Jonathan Richman and John Flansburgh from They Might Be Giants, and, the guys from The Dictators. And so, making the film and then shooting the band playing live and stuff was just so much fun. It was absolutely great trip.
Interesting little side story. When I first started my theater company in Los Angeles, we were in the downtown LA Arts District, and the first building I leased was the bottom floor area of what is known as the American Hotel. And it used to be a place called Al's Bar, which was like the punk rock mecca of Los Angeles during the 80s. And I didn't know that at first. And then we opened the theater, and suddenly all of these people would come in off the street once in a while, just popping their heads in and going, "This was Al's Bar, and we saw this band here, and we saw that band here, and I banged my head against that wall, and I threw up in that corner." And, that whole punk rock scene tended to have that sort of very bohemian, very extravagant aspect to it. Connecting that to Edward de Vere, when he does come back to England, he basically creates this sort of cavil of writers, this sort of bohemian eclectic group of artists that he surrounds himself with when he has Fisher's Folly. I think that might make a great documentary.
A good film. Right. That would be a good one. Absolutely.
Just maybe throwing it out there, just sticking a bee in your bonnet. That's all.
you know what, I need to go and see where that house was. That's my next thing. I'm going to go there. So yes, absolutely.
What is next
Thanks.
on the books for you? You're promoting this film and you're getting it out there. And what exactly next does that entail besides the screenings? And we'll make sure before we leave to let people know where they can find it and how they can get it and watch it at home as well. But what's next? What's next for you?
Well, I will be. I'm going to South by Southwest, which is the big film festival in Austin, in 2 weeks, because I'm still looking for international distribution. So that's the next thing on the producer side that I'm focused on. We want to make it available. We have lots of fans in Australia and throughout Europe who are waiting for the film. So I'm excited about that. And I will be, continuing to go to universities and high schools to present the film and talk about the whole aspect of the sexuality, because I've developed some curriculum called Shakespeare for Bullies, which is all about the references to gender identity and sexuality in the plays and using that to address that in schools. So that's something I'm really excited about. And then for myself personally, I would really love to do a narrative film, actually, because they're quicker to shoot once you get the funding in place and the actors and all of the talent. You can shoot a narrative film so much more quickly than a documentary. So that's something I'm thinking about. And it's it's a screenplay that I've written that's based in London. So when I'm in London in April, I'm going to try to do a little bit of research for that. So
some site hunting.
That's it. Yes.
Awesome. That sounds like a great plan. One of the things that you're talking about, taking the film into schools and addressing this issue of gender identity and sexuality. And I have to say, I agree with you that the evidence is very, very strong that Edward de Vere was bisexual. It's obvious that he wasn't merely homosexual, because he had notorious female lovers and fathered children illegitimately, or at least one that we know of for a fact. And so he's definitely a bisexual character in my mind. What are the aspects of that? You mentioned that there's some resistance amongst Oxfordians to embracing that topic or research into that or more of that. What do you find? Are you finding resistance with your materials with this Shakespeare for Bullies and moving forward with the schools, or are you finding them much more open?
No, they are open, and that's great. No, so I think, and again, my students, college students, are very open to this idea. It doesn't, they think it's interesting and they want to find out more. But the resistance has been, about the relationship between de Vere and Southampton. I mean, that's what people disagree about. They think that the sonnets, are talking about a different kind of relationship, not a sexual one. So I think that's...
Well, I have heard the argument on both sides and I'd have to say that it's one or the other. There's definitely a relationship of extreme love between these two men. And if it's not a homosexual love, then it's definitely a familial love. And then that gets into areas that people really don't like to talk about, which is the idea that Southampton could possibly be de Vere's son. And I don't know which is more taboo, that he was de Vere's lover or that he was de Vere's son. But the one thing that I think is interesting is when you correlate these, the idea that as a homosexual, he would have had to stay, that term that we've used historically forever, is in the closet about it. And obviously, as you can imagine, being a theater artist, I have a great number of homosexual friends, many of whom did have to remain secretive about it through a big portion of their lives. Some who were able to be more open and honest about it because of their family structure, others not. And you would think that there'd be an empathy among Oxfordians for that condition and that type of oppression, because how many Oxfordians have had to been closet Oxfordians for a while.
That's an interesting analogy. Right. That's a good one.
And you would seem to me like you would embrace more inclusivity and acceptance because you lived it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, again, I think, I can't say enough about the support that I have received. The people like Hank Whittemore has been fabulous, and he's brilliant and charming and a wonderful writer and producer himself. He's an Emmy award-winning writer, and he has been just wonderful. He does disagree with me, but he came and did the Q&A with me in the Hudson Valley in New York at the Rosendale Theater. So he's just been fabulous. So I don't want to give the wrong impression that, people haven't criticized my film because of that. It's just something that not a lot of people agree with. So
one of the major themes of this program always has been and will always continue to be the promotion of the idea that we should continue to ask questions, not just about aspects of what's happening around us in the world every day, but things that we've been taught or told throughout our lives or throughout history, as well as aspects of this topic. We promote here that you need to ask questions, and I don't think anything negative can come from the continuing to ask these questions. Is this painting a homosexual relationship? Is this painting a parental relationship?
Right.
What can we do to further discover the truth about both or either or none, for that matter?
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is I was asked a question by a professor recently who, is not an Oxfordian, and he asked me several things that I don't know the answer to. And I said, it's not in my film because I don't know the answer. We're still discovering new information all the time, which is wonderful, and I totally support the research that's being done, with the support of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. And there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot more to learn. And that's what I think, as I said, that's what scholarly inquiry is about. It's about having an open mind and being open to being wrong. You have to be able to admit you're wrong. I think that's a big problem for some people. I did want to talk about where people can find the film.
Yes, let's do that.
Can we do that now? Thank you so much. So it just came out on iTunes and on Amazon Prime. It's also on Vimeo on demand and YouTube. You can just type in the name, Nothing is Truer Than Truth. And I would love if people have seen the film, if they would also review it. So that would be really great. So
Absolutely.
iTunes, Amazon Prime. It's also going to be at retailers, Barnes & Noble and Best Buy, and it'll be everywhere soon. But right now, it would really help us if people would go to iTunes and review the film. That would be great.
It starts streaming it, and if you'd like to own an actual hard copy, it will be available to you very soon. I'm sure you'll be able to
Yes, you
get
can
that.
You can order a DVD on Amazon right now.
Fantastic. So if you're not happy with just being able to stream it on your device and you'd like to have one for your library, go and do that and add it to your library. Take a look at Nothing Truer Than Truth. Our special guest this episode has been Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, the filmmaker and the genius behind the film, Nothing Truer Than Truth. And we were so lucky to have her here with us today. Please be sure to check out other films and books and sources about this issue. If you have more questions, don't forget you can always visit ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. This program is brought to you by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. So if you'd like to learn more, go to ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, your source and resource for more information about the Shakespeare authorship question. Cheryl, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve. It was really fun. Really enjoyed it.
And best of luck with you on getting the film out there and with your school outreach. And I can't wait to see what your next project's going to be. If I can help, let me know, because I'm so curious about filmmaking from a theater artist point of view. I have known nothing about that aspect. I know nothing about cinematography or filmmaking. I'd love to be involved in some type of project like that. So let me know if there's anything. I'll be a gaffer or whatever that is.
Okay. That sounds
whatever
great.
a gaffer is, I'll do that job.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks,
All right.
Cheryl. Be sure to download our other episodes here of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth of Shakespeare authorship at Dragon Wagon Radio. Check out some of the other Dragon Wagon Radio podcast series. I think you'll be intrigued. Don't forget to give us a rate and a review. Tell the world how much you enjoy this show and let others know to tune in as well. I'm your host, Stephen Sable. Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.